Now, as I mentioned last week, nuclear energy is back in fashion in France, with the Macron government announcing it'll build at least 6 new nuclear power plants over the next 3 decades.
France will also be extending the lifespan of existing older plants, an abrupt reversal after previously having committed to closing 12 of the country's 56 nuclear centers. 6 next-generation models of the European pressurized reactor are currently planned, with 8 more being considered. Construction set to begin in 2028, targeting a completion date of 2035 at a cost of roughly €50 billion in public financing.
Now, the French move is a real recognition from France that you can't get to net zero without going nuclear, and in France's case, without expanding its nuclear energy. And with 4 coal-fired power plants set to close early in Australia, Eraring we knew about from last week, then there was already Liddell, Loy Yang and Bayswater announced. Of course, it's time to continue a sensible debate in this country about a nuclear future. Helen Cook is Principal of Global Nuclear Energy Advisory. She joins me in the studio now. Good to talk to you again, Helen. Of course, many viewers will remember you from the nuclear documentary we did here at Sky. You've got enormous experience in this area. You know, the talk up until very recently was that even France was going to try and scale down its nuclear energy. So were you surprised by this move from Emmanuel Macron?
Actually, Chris, no, I wasn't. I think it's probably the decision and the announcement that we've really been expecting from a country that today generates 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, and historically that number's been higher.
The logic's compelling, isn't it? If you want to get to net zero, it is so compelling, and France has such a head start because it's there already. But it's not just about France, is it? Because the UK, Germany, Italy, some of the world's biggest economies actually rely on French electricity to help them out from time to time.
That's right, Chris. And I think when President Macron announced this decision, he chose his words very carefully and very wisely, and he said carbon-free, safe and sovereign. And I think really energy sovereignty in Europe is a really big issue right now with the EU's reliance on Russian gas importation. And so if you look at France's nuclear industry, apart from its need to procure uranium from friendly countries like Australia and Canada, really France has a sovereign nuclear energy industry.
That's a critical point. And in fact, that helped to initiate the French nuclear push in the first place, because they wanted that sovereignty. They didn't want to rely on overseas petrol, oil and gas. Now, tell us, though, about the mechanics of this. You've been heavily involved all around the world in the planning approvals and the legal approvals to get nuclear reactors up and running. It's already in place for France, of course, but will it still be a slow process to expand some nuclear reactors, to extend their lives and also to build others from scratch?
Look, France is way ahead of the game. As you've said, they have an existing industry, existing capacity. They've been building these reactors in France, but also in other countries in the world, and they're operating. And what France is planning to do is actually to take the lessons learned from the EPRs that they have built in China, that's about to come online in Finland, in France as well, and also in the UK. And they've developed a new design which actually takes on board the lessons learned. So they will move carefully, but they have the ability to move quite quickly.
Look, it does make me laugh a bit when the naysayers say, oh, it's too hard to do nuclear energy in Australia. Think about what sort of legislations and protective measures and safety and all those things you'd have to do. Well, there's a legal framework in France and there's a legal framework in the US and the UK and all sorts of safety provisions. These are sophisticated liberal democracies. We can learn from them. Surely Australia should be getting started, getting some of these mechanisms in place in case common sense knocks us on the head eventually and we want to actually have nuclear energy.
Chris, I could not agree with you more. I think creating nuclear energy optionality is absolutely what we need to be doing for Australia. And as you said, nuclear is not an overnight proposition. It does take time. It may take years. Australia is very well positioned to move ahead considering all of our existing nuclear infrastructure and assets, but there's work to do, and that work spans legal, regulatory, social engagement, physical infrastructure, market structures. There's a lot of work that we need to do. But instead of that being a negative, Chris, and instead of that being, oh, that nuclear takes too long and there's all this work you have to do, that could actually be seen as an opportunity an opportunity to be strategic, an opportunity to be smart, an opportunity to learn from what the rest of the world has done when they've developed nuclear energy, and to do it really well and successfully in Australia.
Well, spot on. It's what a sophisticated economy would do. And instead, though, we actually have laws in this country right now that make the nuclear option illegal.
And they are very problematic. But for me, what we need to do is not necessarily have the debate on overturning those prohibitions today, but to our discussion just then, what we need to do is start the work that is necessary to position Australia as a country that can successfully deploy nuclear, maybe later this decade, maybe early in the 2030s.
Do you have much optimism about that? I know the federal government's saying it's looking at what's going on in the rest of the world, which even 10 years ago you wouldn't have been game to say that. So do you see that there's a bit of a shift on?
I do, and since I returned to Australia from 13 years overseas, I was delighted to see that there is this shift. But we still come back to the essential point, that there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and there's a huge opportunity for Australia if we start that work sooner rather than later.
Thanks so much for joining us again, Helen.
Pleasure.
I appreciate it. Helen Cook there, who is all over this industry. As you know, it just operates so effectively around the world. France is going to double down. Australia has some of the largest uranium resources in the world, yet we continue to refuse to take this option.